Chapter 1, The Evolution of Psychology. So this is Lecture 2. Basic questions. What were the behavioral, psychoanalytic, and humanistic perspectives in psychology? So we're continuing on. We started with structuralism and functionalism. Now we're going to talk about the other perspectives, beginning with behaviorism. So the principal contributors to the behavioral perspective in psychology were John Watson, the gentleman you see in the image right there, and then B.F. Skinner, who we'll talk about in a couple of minutes. So John Watson was an American, and he published a very important paper as a graduate student in 1913 that eventuated in a sea change in psychology. Watson was frustrated as a graduate student with the progress that psychology had made over the last couple of decades as the study of consciousness. Essentially, Watson advanced the notion that psychology should cease to be a science that studies consciousness using introspection because it's essentially producing information that is useless. Watson advocated for changing both the subject matter of psychology as well as the methods for studying it. More specifically, Watson argued that psychology should be the scientific study of observable behavior, not consciousness. To join the ranks of the other natural scientists, psychology would have to be an empirical science, that is, making direct observations of behavior and not indirect observations of other people's conscious experience. So behavior became the subject matter of psychology. To Watson, most behavior was learned. And so early studies in behaviorism followed a stimulus-response model. That is, Watson was interested in those basic reflexive responses that we have to external stimuli, which he called associations. And building on those basic associations were learned associations. For example, somebody can have a fear of loud noises, and the natural response to that would be a startle. But if you pair another stimulus, like darkness, with a loud noise, then over repeated pairings of darkness with the loud noise, let's say a thunderstorm at night, you might acquire a fear of the dark. So Watson believed that all behavior, even the most complex behavior, was built up from basic, unlearned, reflexive stimulus response associations, and then overlaying upon those stimulus response associations were learned associations. So perhaps all behavior is learned. The focus of the behaviorist was on the impact of the environment, and the behaviorists tended to de-emphasize any sort of genetic determinism, as a lot of individuals were doing at the time, suggesting that biology is destiny. Rather, Watson said, no, biology is not destiny, that the human person comes into the world a blank slate, so to speak, and they become who they are through their learning and through their experience. Watson is famous for this quote: "Give me a dozen healthy infants, well-formed in my own special world to bring them up in, and I'll guarantee to take any one at random and train him to become any type of specialist I might select: doctor, lawyer, artist, merchant, chief, and yes, even beggar, man, and thief." So Watson was very confident that where the real action was with respect to us being and becoming who we are was in the environment. Everything was learned. And this perspective mapped on to the spirit of the times in the early 1900s. The United States was a place where a lot of people were emigrating to. It was a land of opportunity and possibility. people weren't bound up, locked into their past, race, religious preferences, and so forth. Biology was not destiny. Caste was not destiny, but rather people could become whoever they possibly could become through learning and experience in the world. So the environment was really where the focus of the early behaviorist was, not on genetics. So something to consider, and I'll throw these consider this slides in to these lectures here and there, but something that probably you should ask yourself every now and then is how much of who we are and who we become is attributable to our nature. That is, how much of who we are, our potentialities, our abilities, and that sort of thing is something that we inherit from our parents. How much is attributable to the experiences that we have in the world. So, for example, we'll take a lawyer. President Obama is an attorney. How much of his accomplishment and the achievements that he's made are attributable to his nature, his genetics, and to his experience? How about an artist, Lady Gaga? How much of who she is, her success, and her talent and so forth is attributable to her genetics and to her experience in the world, learning? How about yourself? What do you aspire to be? What are you doing right now? How much of who you are is attributable to your genes and to your experience? It's a difficult question to answer clearly. The most likely correct answer would be a little bit of both. The second behaviorist I want to talk about is B.F. Skinner. Skinner developed his own brand of behaviorism that you'll learn more about in Chapter 6, but just briefly, Skinner was a believer in Watson's version of, or Watson's view of human nature that is primarily due to learning and experience in the world and less to do with genetics. So the focus of the Skinnerian behaviorist was again on observable behavior and on learning. The action was in the environment. But Skinner's view was that we are not merely passive respondents to stimuli, environmental stimuli, but rather we're active, motivated organisms that when placed in particular environments, we do stuff, we move around and so forth, and we learn through experiencing the consequences of our actions. So it's a more active view of the human person and the non-human animal. So to break down Skinner's perspective here, we have the ABCs of behavior: antecedents, behavior, and consequences. So it kind of goes like this. Every situation or environment has its own set of antecedent conditions. That is, these are the rules, both unspoken and spoken, that define what's going to happen in that particular environment. A classroom, for example, is an environment that has its own antecedent conditions, rules and expectations and so forth. Same with an online class. There are certain rules that are both implicit, that is, they're unwritten or unspoken, and then the explicit rules and expectations. And then you drop a motivated organism, a human or a rat or a pigeon, into that environment, and it begins to move around. So by motivated organism, I mean that, for example, Skinner, who did most of his research with rats and pigeons, kept his animals at about 75% of their normal body weight. So these animals were constantly hungry, and hunger is a powerful motivator. So they were dropped into particular environments, and they began to move around in those environments. And by moving around, they begin to experience consequences of their actions, reward or punishment for doing something. And it's through our experience of those consequences that we learn. So an example of an organism learning something, a human, would be that it would find itself in an environment, it would begin to move around and do something and experience a consequence. So for Skinner, reinforcement, the idea of reinforcement was key. And you can think of reinforcement as any experience that increases the likelihood that a behavior will be repeated. So a motivated organism moves around, experiences a reinforcer, and for example, if it's a reward, then that's going to increase the likelihood that the behavior that led to the reward will be repeated. I want to put this in a context of an example. So you have an individual who has the personality attribute of being the life of the party, the social extrovert, that person. So how does a person develop that particular behavioral repertoire? So we have the stimulus context, it's a party. That individual tells jokes. That's the behavior. The reinforcer would be the attention, the laughter, the compliments, and so forth for telling the joke. That's the reinforcer. In this case, it's a positive reinforcer. It's a reward. And the effect on the behavior, that is the joke-telling behavior, is that the probability of that behavior is now increased. So Skinner's view is that we experience the consequences of our behavior, reinforcement, punishment, and so forth, over the course of our lifespan, and by so doing, we internalize those contingencies, and they become part of our behavioral repertoire. Skinner wrote a controversial and influential book back in the early 70s called Beyond Freedom and Dignity. So Skinner was a real thinker. He wasn't a lab scientist only. He was a real thinker, and so his notion of behaviorism extended well beyond trying to come up with these basic principles of behavior and learning, but rather he extended to include society. And in Beyond Freedom and Dignity was Skinner's argument for cultural engineering. That is, if smart people who understand human behavior can arrange things according to the principles of conditioning, Skinner's brand of conditioning, which was operant conditioning, then essentially we can create environments that will establish individuals who will be kinder to each other, they won't steal, they won't kill each other, and essentially we can create a utopian society based on the principles of Skinnerian behaviors. Beyond Freedom and Dignity is so named because what Skinner identified as the major obstacle was this notion of free will. That is, according to Skinner, free will is an illusion. It's a convenient construction to explain why we do what we do. But it has no place in Skinnerian behaviors, and because it truly is an illusion, according to Skinner. To Skinner, behavior is being determined by environmental forces, consequences of our behavior. We don't need to refer to some intention in explaining behavior. We can explain behavior perfectly adequately by identifying those environmental factors that draw it forth. So free will, according to Skinner, was a barrier to adopting social engineering based on the principles of conditioning. That is, we're so enamored with this idea that our intentions and our will underpin our behavior, and that we can change our behavior at any time as an act of will. We're so in love with that idea that it's standing in the way of essentially creating a better society based on the principles of conditioning. Well, the book was not well received by a number of people. Certainly it was an intellectual tour de force. It was an interesting idea, but it wasn't received well by the majority of the general population. And one of the criticisms is certainly it would be nice if we had a utopian society where everybody was really being very nice to each other, but then it begs the question, who makes the rules? Who makes the rules? And it also begs the question, and that's the image I have down here on the lower right, is whose idea of society is the best one? So certainly Hitler's Germany, a lot of people followed Hitler and adhered to his ideas because they believed that Hitler was correct in his thinking to create an idealized Aryan society. But the judgment of history is in contrast to that belief, clearly. Psychoanalysis. So here's another perspective, the psychoanalytic perspective in psychology. Sigmund Freud, who I suspect that most people are familiar with, was an Austrian. He was a physician and psychiatrist. He began his studies in medical school, interested in neuroscience, but because he was a Jew, he faced prejudice and discrimination in entering higher education. So he became a medical doctor and ultimately became the psychiatrist Sigmund Freud that most people are familiar with. So Freud's work began early on primarily with upper-class Viennese women who were suffering from what was called back then hysterical symptoms or neuroses. And out of Freud's work with these women came his ideas about the human person. Freud's major departure from his contemporaries, that is, the other psychologists and psychiatrists of the day, was his emphasis on the influence of unconscious processes. That is, to Freud, our thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and so forth were being primarily driven by forces outside of our immediate awareness. That is, we really don't know why we do what we do fully, but rather there's unconscious forces at work that are producing our thoughts and our feelings and our behaviors. So the notion of the unconscious was Freud's major contribution in the power of these unconscious forces to guide our behavior, thinking, and emotional life. So take a look at this picture. So this is an image from a psychological test known as the thematic apperception test. And the idea is that you'd look at the picture and then you would hatch a story about what's going on in that scene. What led up to it, what are the people thinking and feeling, and so forth. So my guess is that most people would come up with some kind of story. The question is, how would the stories differ? What kind of stories we tell, according to Freud, depends on what's happening for us internally and possibly unconsciously. So if I hatch a story about a woman who's grieving the death of her beloved, that might speak to something that's going on inside of me with respect to the relationships that I have in my life with the people that I care about and so forth. But if I hatch a very different kind of story, like maybe she's ashamed of herself because she had sex with this man that she didn't know. It was a one-night stand. Now she's got to go home and face her roommates or something like that, or face herself. That's a different kind of story that reflects possibly different kinds of internal dynamics. So the kind of stories we tell, Freud would suggest, depend a lot on what's going on for us in our inner life, both consciously and unconsciously, but largely unconsciously. So something to consider as you're taking this psychology class is how much of our behavior is automatic and determined by our unconscious. So this is in contrast with Skinner and Watson, that were suggesting that most of our behavior is attributable to environmental factors. rewards, punishments, stimuli, and that sort of thing in the environment. What Freud is suggesting is that most of our behavior is coming from forces that we are not entirely aware of. The humanist revolt, so this is the last perspective that we're going to talk about in this lecture. So the behavioral and the psychoanalytic theories were unappealing to many. And you have to remember that this is an early picture of psychology, that is, psychology is developing in the early 1900s. So this is around the late 40s into the 50s. And one of the criticisms was that both went beyond their data. That is, Freud's theories were derived from troubled individuals, and based on Freud's work with these troubled individuals, Freud was making broad, sweeping claims about humanity. Behaviors could not explain why learning occurs even when rewards are not offered. So one of the primary criticisms launched against the behaviors was the acquisition of language. Language seems to emerge in the human person in the absence of any obvious reward. Certainly parents will be delighted when their child will say mommy or daddy. Certainly there's some reward there. But it's a universal thing across all cultures that emerges seemingly on its own. So we have to be able to consider the possible influence, genetics. There's something going on in the brain that's universal, that doesn't have anything to do with environmental inputs, or it has not everything to do with environmental inputs. Same thing with walking. Kids will strive to walk. They will fall down, they will hurt themselves, which certainly is a punisher, but yet they'll get up and they'll strive to walk. So there's some things we can do generally that appear to be done in the absence of any sort of external reward. There's something beyond rewards and punishments and environmental factors that drive us forward in the world. Some basic other kind of motivation that comes from within, not from without. Overemphasis on animal research. So Skinner was a guy that spent a lot of time in the lab working with rats and pigeons. Skinner unproblematically generalized the findings of his studies with rats and pigeons to the human case. So basic principles of learning that he was discovering with rats and pigeons, he also believed applied to humans. The problem with that is that human behavior that occurs outside of a laboratory is infinitely more complex than animal behavior occurring in very, very rarefied experimental settings. So if you want to really truly find out about people, you've got to study people. And Skinner didn't do a whole lot of research with people. And then the last one was that both were deterministic. That is, the behaviors were suggesting that our behavior is being determined by environmental forces, stimuli, responses, or stimuli, rewards and punishments and so forth. Freud was suggesting that most of what we do and who we are is being determined by these unconscious forces that we can only be dimly aware of or not aware of at all. And many individuals objected to that idea, saying there's more to the human person than that. And this was the humanistic revolt. So humanistic psychology became a movement in psychology beginning in the 50s and then extending through the 70s, led by Abraham Maslow and Carl Rogers. So the first image you see there is Abraham Maslow. The bottom image is Carl Rogers. So the idea behind humanistic psychology is that we're intrinsically motivated to gain mastery or efficacy over our environment. That is, there's some other kind of motivation other than rewards and punishers and stimuli. And also there's more to us than these unconscious forces that we cannot be aware of. There's some other kind of motivation. This was advanced in an influential paper in the late 1940s called Motivation Reconsidered, basically outlining that many behaviors that humans engage in, as well as animals, occurred without the apparent presence of reward. So there's something about us that drives us forward in the world to become who we are, to master our environment, and so forth. We're rational thinking, feeling organisms. Our subjective experience of ourselves and the world matters. So here we are in a discipline that began by defining itself as the scientific study of consciousness. Here we are with the humanistic psychologists resurrecting the importance of conscious experience. That is, how we feel and think about ourselves matters. A good example of this would be self-esteem. If anybody has ever performed in front of an audience, given a speech or given a performance, a recital or something like that, you know how confidence matters. Having a good sense of yourself, a good feeling about yourself in that kind of context will improve your performance. If you have low confidence, low self-esteem in that particular domain, it'll impact your performance. So what the humanistic psychologists are saying, this experience of the self matters. And then the last here is we're not pigeons. That is, the humanistic psychologists disagreed with Skinner's idea that what can be discovered with animals, rats and pigeons and so forth, in laboratory settings explained fully the human person. That is, people are different from rats and pigeons. In essence, we're active creatures with an intrinsic motivation to gain mastery over environment. We can change and grow as an act of will. We can look inward, understand ourselves, and change and grow as an act of will. So there's more to us than passive responding to environmental stimuli and unconscious forces. And that's the message of the humanistic psychology movement. So a little summary here. What we've talked about in the last two lectures is psychology as a young science, as an early science. One of the major questions that a young science faces is what the subject matter of the science should be and how should it be studied. So we looked at structuralism and functionalism initially, and then we've looked at behaviorism, psychoanalysis, and the humanistic perspective. Both have, or all of these perspectives, have a slightly different view of the subject matter of psychology and how it should be studied. But also they have a different view of the nature of human nature. That is, what makes us tick, what makes us who we are. What we talked about today are the behavioral perspectives. The behaviorists would primarily see the human person as being determined by factors in the environment. The psychoanalytic perspective has us being primarily determined by unconscious forces. The humanistic psychology says we're more than that. We're different from animals. Our behavior and emotional life and our thoughts are being driven by something other than environmental factors and unconscious forces. We're rational, feeling creatures with free will who can change and grow as an act of will. So concept checked here. Organisms tend to repeat responses that lead to positive outcomes, and they tend not to repeat responses that lead to neutral or negative outcomes. These words would most likely have been said by A. B. F. Skinner, B. John Watson, C. Carl Rogers, D. Sigmund Freud. The answer is A. So that description maps on to B.F. Skinner's brand of behaviorism. Organisms are active in the environment. By being active, they experience consequences of their behaviors, and they learn from the consequences of their behaviors. Learning objectives for this lecture. 1. Describe, compare, and contrast the basic ideas advanced by the behavioral, psychoanalytic, and humanistic perspectives in psychology. Know the principles, contributors' names. 2. Describe the cognitive, biological, and evolutionary perspectives. Know the principal contributors' names. 3. Identify the factors that have led to an increased interest in understanding how cultural factors influence behavior. So those last two are red font objectives. That means read about them in the text. We haven't talked about them in either Lecture 1 or Lecture 2.